Well, good afternoon, and I'd like to give some brief remarks in my national capacity before we hear from Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister, my good friend Mariana Betsa. Today, the Security Council will mark the 4th anniversary of Russia's illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and I have seen myself with my own eyes the devastating impact of that illegal full-scale invasion in Kiev and across Ukraine, the destruction, the damage. I've heard directly from the children who've been affected, the civilians who've been affected. And on this grim anniversary, Mariana, the UK's message to the Ukrainian people is a simple one. Britain is with you and we will stand with you. And that's why today we have announced £20 million of new funding for emergency energy support to fix the damage caused by Russia's brutal attacks over this winter. We've also announced £5.7 million to provide humanitarian assistance to frontline communities, those who need evacuation or have been impacted by airstrikes or internal displacement. And while we've announced our largest ever package of sanctions to tackle the Russian war machine, nearly 300 designations, we will stand with Ukraine as long as it takes to secure a just and lasting peace and beyond. So I'm very pleased to introduce Minister Betsa to speak on behalf of the countries who have assembled here today in support of Ukraine.
Thank you, Minister. Distinguished colleagues, I would like to read out a statement on behalf of Ukraine, Albania, Andorra, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Marshall Islands, Monaco, Montenegro, the Netherlands, New Zealand, North Macedonia, Norway, Romania, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Moldova, Republic of Korea, San Marino, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. Today we mark 4 years since the start of the Russia's Federation unprovoked and unjustified full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and 12 years since the beginning of its aggression marked by illegal occupation of Crimea. The ongoing war of aggression constitutes a grave and continuing violation of the UN Charter and of fundamental principles of international law. It strikes at the very foundation of the international rules-based order and undermines global peace and security. We welcome and strongly support the clear and principled message expressed today by the General Assembly, calling for the immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire, and for comprehensive, just and lasting peace in line with UN Charter and international law. We underscore the urgent need of concrete humanitarian measures, including the complete exchange of prisoners of war, the release of unlawfully detained persons, and safe return of all internees and civilians who have been forcibly transferred or deported, including thousands of Ukrainian children. These steps are essential confidence-building measures and a moral imperative. We express our deepest concern over Russia's continued and intensified attacks against civilians, civilian objects, and Ukraine's critical energy infrastructure. We condemn the weaponization of winter and attacks on energy facilities. Russia has deliberately weaponized winter, depriving millions of civilians of electricity, heating, and water during freezing temperatures, intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects are a violation of international humanitarian law, and those responsible must be held to account. We reaffirm our unwavering commitment to ensure full accountability for crimes committed under international law. Justice for victims is not optional. It is indispensable for sustainable peace and for preventing future atrocities worldwide. We reiterate our demand to Russia to stop its war of aggression against Ukraine and to ensure full, immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all Russian forces and military equipment from the territory of Ukraine within internationally recognized borders. We reaffirm our strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine within internationally recognized borders and reiterate that attempted illegal annexation of parts of sovereign territory of Ukraine by Russia has no validity under international law. It doesn't form the basis for any alteration of its status. We welcome the sustained efforts of the United States, European countries, and other member states aimed at bringing the end to the war. We stand united in our determination to achieve comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine, consistent with the UN Charter, including the principles of sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states. I thank you for your attention.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. The 10,110th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. I would like to welcome the distinguished Deputy Prime Minister, ministers and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. And in accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Austria, Cyprus, Czechia, Estonia, Georgia, Germany, Lithuania, Poland, Spain, Sweden, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. And in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I now invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda, and I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Secretary General Guterres, unfortunately, was unable to be in New York today, but I will deliver his statement. Thank you. 4 years after the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the war remains a stain on our collective conscience. Day after day, year after year, we have witnessed the cascading consequences of this blatant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. Shattered lives, devastated communities, and deepened regional and global instability. The human toll is catastrophic. Despite unprecedented diplomatic efforts, last year was the deadliest for Ukrainian civilians since 2022. More than 15,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine since the start of the invasion, and more than 41,000 injured. Millions have been forced to flee from their homes. Millions more require life-saving assistance. Human rights violations are rampant. The plight of Ukrainian children is particularly dire. More than 3,200 children have been killed or injured. More than 1/3 of Ukrainian children remain displaced, and an estimated 2.2 million require humanitarian assistance. A whole generation has lost years of education as schools have come under fire. Mr. President, this winter, the Russian Federation intensified strikes against Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure. Large-scale attacks have killed and injured scores of civilians and deprived millions of electricity, heating, and water, for prolonged periods, including in the capital, Kiev. In sub-zero temperatures, strikes on electricity, heating, and water systems turn access to basic services into a matter of life and death. Civilians in the Russian Federation are also increasingly affected by reported Ukrainian strikes. International humanitarian law is unequivocal. Attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are strictly prohibited. I condemn all such attacks, no matter where they occur. I urge both sides to implement an immediate moratorium on all such attacks. Mr. President, the ongoing fighting also poses direct risks to the safe and secure operations of Ukraine's nuclear sites. This unconscionable game of nuclear roulette must cease immediately. I commend the International Atomic Energy Agency and its teams for their critical efforts on the ground, despite the serious dangers involved. Mr. President, even as the fighting rages, the UN is working closely with the government of Ukraine to repair damaged infrastructure, keep people warm, and sustain critical services. Despite limited access and the deteriorating security situation, we are also working with local partners to deliver food, water, medical supplies, and other humanitarian aid, including to those in frontline communities. And I urge member states to fully fund the humanitarian response. Mr. President, throughout the war, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has reported widespread human rights violations, torture, sexual violence, and even executions of prisoners of war and civilian detainees. These acts have gone with virtually no accountability. I welcome ongoing prisoner exchanges and urge that all prisoners of war and detainees be treated humanely and released in accordance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Any Ukrainian children deported or forcibly transferred to the Russian Federation and occupied areas of Ukraine must be returned home to their families without delay. I commend efforts to facilitate such returns and family reunifications. We will continue to work closely with all relevant actors to ensure that this happens in a safe, swift, and verifiable manner. I urge the sides to continue to work constructively to address these concerns as a matter of priority. Mr. President, a year ago, this Council adopted Resolution 2774, imploring a swift end to the conflict and urging a lasting peace between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. I commend the ongoing diplomatic efforts by the United States and others to end the war. We need concrete measures to de-escalate the fighting without delay and to create the space for diplomacy. The longer this war continues, the greater the suffering and the greater the risks for regional and international peace and security. As complex as the path may be, our collective obligation is clear. Use every diplomatic tool to end the war. United Nations expertise is readily available to support the ongoing peace efforts. Our tools are at the disposal of the parties and mediators. The parameters of peace in Ukraine are not a mystery. It must be in accordance with international law, including the UN Charter and relevant UN resolutions. And it must uphold the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Enough with the death, enough with the destruction, enough with the broken lives and shattered futures. It is time for an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire, the first step toward a just peace that saves lives and ends the endless suffering. Thank you.
Well, I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Minister of State for Europe, North America and Overseas Territories of the United Kingdom. As we mark this grim anniversary, I want to reflect on three personal encounters I've had with Ukrainians from all walks of life. They show what Russia's illegal and unprovoked war is doing to civilians, to vital infrastructure, and fundamentally to the rules that we are all here to uphold, our very United Nations Charter. First, a year ago I visited Bucha, and there I met a priest who told me of shocking atrocities carried out by the Russians. He recalled how he dug graves for members of his own congregation after the massacre and swapped his robes for civilian clothes after a fellow priest was killed. And that conversation stays with me because it shows how Russia wages this war. And today, notwithstanding the false claims by the Russian representative in the General Assembly, its forces continue to strike Ukrainian civilians and communities with missiles and drones, killing and destroying. And I should add, of course, that the same disregard for civilian lives is not just evident in Ukraine, it's also evident in the killing of Alexei Navalny, which we are confident was the result of lethal poisoning. Second, last September, I met children who had been forcibly taken from occupied Ukrainian territory by Russian forces. They told me how they were separated from their families with new identities imposed upon them. I have a picture in my office painted by a Ukrainian child who had escaped Russia, now undergoing therapy to deal with the ordeal that they had endured. And Russia is doing this to tens of thousands of children, using them as tools of war. And I have to ask the Russian representative, is there no shame? This must end. And third, last month I spoke to school children in Kiev via video link from a school in East London. And they told me how happy they were that day to be in their classroom learning like all children should be able to, because regular power cuts kept disrupting their lessons, attacks near their schools and their homes, and children all over Ukraine are enduring days and nights marked by air raid sirens and blackouts, by fear and loss. And Save the Children reports that Ukrainian children have endured 4,000 hours of air raid alarms since the start of the full-scale invasion. That's equivalent to more than 5 months of constant alert, and this is taking a severe toll on their mental health. A generation is being robbed of the security and peace that every child in this world deserves. And there is no respite even during the brutal cold of winter. Let us speak the truth in this place. Russia is relentlessly targeting civilian infrastructure, and since October, it has launched 20 mass attacks on Ukraine's energy system, firing more than 1,000 missiles. It has struck again and again, leaving hospitals without power, schools unable to function, families facing winter in darkness and cold. But what has stayed with me after meeting Ukrainians from all walks of life is their incredible courage in the face of this barbarity. It has earned them the respect of people the world over, and the United Kingdom stands by their side, and our people stand by their side every day. Our support is practical and it's sustained. We're strengthening air defences. We're helping Ukraine keep essential services running when power is cut. We are supporting Ukraine to enable the return of stolen children. And we are pursuing justice and accountability through international mechanisms. And today, we have announced a £30 million package for emergency energy support, humanitarian assistance and justice and accountability in Ukraine. This builds on billions of pounds of UK support, guarantees and direct military aid to Ukraine since 2022, and we will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes to achieve a just and lasting peace and beyond. This also means keeping up the pressure on Russia and choking off their war machine. And that is why today we have been announcing our largest package of measures since 2022, targeting oil revenues and components fueling that war machine. And we are working with partners across this council and beyond to defend the UN Charter, because Russia's war is illegal and unprovoked. It is an assault on the Charter's foundational principles, respect for sovereignty and for territorial integrity. We call again on Russia to comply with international law. and we are pressing it to engage meaningfully in the US-led peace process. Along with France, we are also leading the coalition of the willing to support Ukraine now and to ensure that peace endures. Ukraine has made clear its readiness for peace, but Russia has not. Instead, it continues to escalate attacks on civilians while stalling negotiations. So let us be clear again in this place what peace requires: a full, immediate and unconditional ceasefire, a settlement that results in a sovereign, secure and independent Ukraine, all the stolen children and prisoners of war returned, and justice for the crimes that have been committed. That is what every Ukrainian deserves, and it is our responsibility as members of this council to demand it. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Baiba Braže, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Under-Secretary General DiCarlo, for her briefing. On behalf of the Secretary General, and let me pay respect to the UN staff working on the ground in Ukraine and doing their job in very difficult circumstances. Excellencies, 1,461 days of entirely illegal, unjustified, and unprovoked war. A war with root causes known by the entire world. It's Russia's imperial and colonial aspirations. UN Charter principles shattered, countless Ukrainian lives lost and destroyed, war crimes, global consequences for food security, ecocide, landmines, global arms race, all because of one state, which refuses to accept that empires are dead. One state that 4 years ago blocked the Council from taking action. One state that a year ago vetoed the reference to the UN Charter in the Security Council resolution. Today, the same one state continues to sabotage the peace efforts led by the United States and Ukraine. This state is Russia, a permanent member of this council, with a legal responsibility in the UN Charter to uphold international peace and security. The good news is that Russia's aggression is failing. In 4 years, it has achieved none of its strategic goals. Last year alone, Russia lost more than 400,000 troops killed and severely wounded, and it was able to capture less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. At the same time, as confirmed by UN reports, and the briefing by Under-Secretary General today, Russia's missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian civilians last year were the deadliest since the start of the war. During the coldest winter of the decade, Russia constantly destroys civilian and energy infrastructure. Millions are suffering in freezing temperatures. Children and elderly are freezing to death in their beds. Russia has forcibly transferred around 20,000 Ukrainian children and militarized Ukrainian children in the occupied territories. In so-called summer camps, they are forced to operate drones, dig trenches, mine and demine areas, and use grenades and firearms. Russia has also bombed first responders, humanitarian workers, and clearly marked UN aid envoys and embassies in Kiev. Mr. President, Russia's war has severe global consequences. Countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East are not safe from Russia's colonial imperial ambitions. Russia has manipulated and coerced thousands to the front lines to kill Ukrainians. We have seen the videos of Russian commanders using foreigners as cannon fodder. I urge all countries to protect their citizens from this fate. From dying for what? For Russia's desperate attempts to restore its empire. Mr. President, Ukrainians continue to inspire us with their bravery and resilience. Ukraine is a strong democracy and a proud nation. Ukraine will stay free and sovereign, but it's time to bring this war to an end. to have an immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire. Latvia fully supports the peace efforts led by the US in Ukraine. We stand for a just and lasting peace, a peace that guarantees Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, a peace where Russia is unable to resume its aggression. But there is only one country and one man standing between us here and peace. This country is Russia, and this man is Vladimir Putin. This is why Latvia urges all countries to exert maximum pressure on Russia, restrict Russia's economy, impose sanctions, isolate it, and internationalizations, to stop the killing and ensure accountability for war crimes. I thank you. Slava Ukraini.
I thank Her Excellency Barbara Braje for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also thank the Undersecretary General for her sobering briefing and welcome the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine to this meeting. And thank you, Minister, for leading the meeting here today. Mr. President, exactly 4 years ago, as this Council met in emergency session, and as the Secretary General appealed directly to President Putin to make peace prevail, Russia launched its unprovoked and illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. For 4 years, this Council has met numerous times to shine a light on the devastation and destruction caused by this aggression, on the humanitarian crisis unleashed, on the children abducted, on the threat of nuclear disaster, and on its global repercussions. Since that day 4 years ago, and despite unspeakable suffering of the Ukrainian people, the fundamental situation has remained largely unchanged. Russia's clear violation of international law and the UN Charter continues. Its aspirations to subjugate Ukraine and unlawfully seize territory by force continue. Ukraine's bravery has remained undeterred as it legitimately exercises its inherent right to self-defense. Mr. President, what has changed over the past 4 years is the scale of death, destruction, and terror inflicted on Ukraine's civilians. In this Russian war of territorial conquest, millions have been forced to flee their homes. Hundreds and thousands of soldiers have perished, and at least 55,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed or injured. For 5 winters in a row, Russian drones and missiles have rained down on Ukraine's energy grid, desperately trying, but failing, to break the Ukrainian people's spirit. We recall that intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects is a serious violation of international humanitarian law and constitutes a war crime. As we've heard from the Undersecretary General, 2025 was in fact the deadliest year for Ukraine's civilian population in this war. Russia's attacks on residential buildings, schools, hospitals, churches, and playgrounds only intensified in this past year. We cannot allow this to continue. Mr. President, exactly 1 year ago, this Council adopted Resolution 2774. This resolution, which Russia supported, implored a swift end to the conflict and urged lasting peace. Quickly thereafter, Ukraine offered an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. It has stood by that offer ever since. President Putin, on the other hand, has repeatedly rejected it, choosing violence and aggression again and again. Russia shows no interest in peace. Rather, its actions are desperate and deeply cynical. Denmark urgently calls on Russia to adhere to all its obligations under international law and to engage in good faith in negotiations to end this war. Mr. President, this morning, the General Assembly reaffirmed its call for a ceasefire and lasting peace in Ukraine with an overwhelming majority. Around this table, and indeed around the globe, there is a clear demand for peace, for a just, sustainable, and lasting end to this terrible war. Demands to uphold Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, as well as accountability for Russia's crimes. Anything less, or without robust security guarantees for Ukraine, would consign future generations to live in constant fear of further invasion. The time for Russia to hear and heed these demands is now. Mr. President, in closing, the United Nations was not founded to bear witness to aggression. It was founded to stop it. The Security Council carries not only authority, but responsibility. Responsibility to maintain international peace and security, to defend the Charter, and to act. Denmark stands with Ukraine, both in word and in deeds. Our support is unwavering. Ukraine and its people deserve to be free, to choose their own destiny, to live in peace and prosperity. On this sad four-year anniversary, let us not only reflect on this imperative, but act on it. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to commend the United Kingdom for convening this meeting as we mark 4 years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I also thank USG DiCarlo for her sobering remarks on behalf of the Secretary General, and I welcome the participation of the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, allow me to begin by reiterating Greece's unwavering solidarity and support to the Ukrainian people as we are sadly standing witness to an ever-worsening humanitarian situation. Ukrainians endure large-scale Russian airstrikes targeting major cities and critical energy infrastructure across the country, weaponizing the energy needs of innocent civilians amidst harsh winter conditions. The targeting of civilians and civilian energy infrastructure is a blatant violation of international humanitarian law and must be condemned. The children of Ukraine, the most vulnerable part of any population, have gravely suffered in the course of these 4 years. More than 3,000 of them have been killed or injured, and thousands more were otherwise gravely affected, uprooted, and transferred out of the country. Greece calls for their immediate, safe, and unconditional return. Despite the recent commendable diplomatic efforts, peace remains elusive. Greece has consistently called for a ceasefire and has vigorously supported the objective of a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in Ukraine, a peace that will be in line with international law and the UN Charter, and in particular, with the principles of respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. We firmly reject revisionist policies and any attempt to change borders through the use of force. Mr. President, the rules and principles enshrined in the UN Charter are the very foundations of the international legal order we subscribed to 80 years ago. It is in the vital interest of this Council and of all the members of the United Nations to keep this order intact and uphold the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. As a founding member of the United Nations, Greece has shaped its foreign policy all along on the basis of respect for international law and the principles of the UN Charter. In this spirit, we remain fully committed to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. In closing, Mr. President, Greece, along with all partners devoted to the same principles, will continue to support efforts aimed at restoring peace in Ukraine, a fair, lasting, and comprehensive peace, a peace that will guarantee a prosperous, independent, and sovereign future for Ukraine, free from the threat of renewed aggression. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr.
President, I wish first and foremost to thank the Undersecretary General, Rosemary DiCarlo, for her briefing. 4 years to the date since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 1 year after the adoption by the Security Council of the resolution which Russia itself voted for, calling for a prompt end to this conflict. This grim anniversary requires that we act to implement the Security Council mandate for the advancement of peace.
Je veux donc saluer ici
I
la
wish
clarté du
to
secrétaire
welcome the
général des
clarity
Nations
of the
Unies
Secretary General of the
qui,
United
comme l'a
Nations,
rappelé la secrétaire
as
générale
was
adjointe,
recalled by
a
the
redit hier les
USG.
exigences
The Secretary
fondamentales
General
qu'impose
yesterday
cet objectif.
recalled the basic premise
Un
of this
cessez-le-feu
objective,
immédiat,
an immediate,
complet
full,
et sans
and
condition
unconditional
comme première
ceasefire
étape vers une
as
paix
the
juste et
first
durable,
step
conforme
towards
à la
a
Charte
just
des
and
Nations
lasting
Unies.
peace in accordance with the Charter of the
Ce
United
matin,
Nations. This
l'Assemblée
morning,
générale a
the General
amplement
Assembly
adopté une
adopted
résolution
by an
présentée par
overwhelming
l'Ukraine
majority a
qui
resolution
demande
submitted by
exactement
Ukraine which
cela.
calls precisely for that.
La poursuite par la
place.
Russie de son agression est
Russia's pursuit of
injustifiable
its aggression is
parce qu'elle constitue
injustifiable
toujours
because it
une violation
continues
majeure de la Charte des Nations Unies,
to fly in the face of the Charter of the United Nations,
parce que les
moreover by
moyens
a
employés sont
permanent
absolument
member of the Security
inacceptables.
Council by means which are completely
Faute de
unacceptable,
parvenir à avancer face aux
unable
lignes de défense de
to
l'armée
make headway
ukrainienne,
against the
la
Ukrainian
Russie se
army's
déchaîne sur l'arrière,
lines of defense, the Russian
infligeant à la
Federation
population
has pulled
civile
out all the
ukrainienne
stops,
un hiver sans
inflicting
chauffage et sans
upon the Ukrainian
électricité,
civilian
sous les
population a
bombes,
winter
par des
without
températures
heating,
glaciales.
without
Malgré
electricity,
les crimes de
with
guerre, la
bombs
Russie
raining
piétine,
down amid glacial
s'acharne
temperatures.
et
Despite
démontre
these war
qu'elle ne
crimes,
veut
the
pas
Russian
la paix.
Federation remains
Monsieur le
obstinate
Président,
and
depuis 4 ans,
intractable,
l'Ukraine
demonstrating
résiste.
that it
Depuis
does not
4 ans,
want
elle se
peace.
bat pour son
For 4 years,
indépendance,
Ukraine has
son
resisted. For
intégrité
4 years,
territoriale,
Ukraine has
sa
been
souveraineté, sa
fighting
liberté.
for its
Les
independence, its
forces
territorial
russes se
integrity,
heurtent
its
à un mur qu'elles ne
sovereignty,
parviennent pas à
its
franchir
freedom. The Russian
et
forces are
qu'elles ne
coming up
parviendront
against
pas
a wall which they
franchir.
are unable to
Il est
breach and
temps
which
que
they
cette
will
guerre
be
s'arrête.
unable to breach. It is
La
time for
négociation
the war
pour y
to
parvenir
end.
doit se faire avec
Negotiations to
lucidité.
achieve this need to be done in
La
a
France
clear-sighted
avait
way.
tout fait
They need to be
pour éviter
conducted
cette
with
guerre.
clear-sightedness. France
Elle fera tout
has
pour
spared no effort
contribuer
to
à
avoid
ce que
this
cette
war.
guerre
We will
s'arrête.
do everything possible to help
Nous
bring
appuyons
it
les
to
efforts
an
de paix en
end.
cours
We support
en lien
the peace
étroit avec nos
efforts
partenaires
underway
américains et
closely
ukrainiens.
in conjunction with
Nous
our
souhaitons
U.S.
y
and
donner
Ukrainian partners.
donner davantage
We
d'ampleur
wish
à ces
to
efforts,
have these efforts
notamment en
bear
y faisant
fruit
entendre plus fort la
to
voix
a
de
greater
l'Europe,
degree, specifically
concernée au
by
plus haut.
broadcasting the
Nous
voice
sommes
of
prêts
Europe, which
à
is most
appuyer un
directly
accord de paix.
affected. We stand ready
Cela
to
implique de
support the
préparer
peace
les
agreement.
conditions
This
d'une paix
requires
durable.
setting the
Le président de la
stage
République
for
et
a
le
lasting
Premier
peace.
ministre
The President of the
britannique
Republic and the British Prime
ont
Minister
réuni ce jour
to
plus de
have
30
to
pays de la
date brought
coalition
together more than 30
budgétaire
countries
qui
of the
demain
coalition of the
garantiront à
willing
l'Ukraine
who
de ne
will
plus devoir revivre une
guarantee
invasion russe.
guarantee
Ces dirigeants
that
ont
Ukraine will
réitéré
no
leur
longer
engagement
have to
indéfectible à œuvrer
relive a
ensemble
Russian
pour parvenir à une paix juste et
invasion.
durable,
Beyond the
conformément au
diplomatic
principe de la Charte des
encounters,
Nations Unies.
there is a
Et
need
ils ont
to
réaffirmé
ensure
que les
that there's
frontières
compliance
internationales
with the Charter of the
ne
United
doivent pas
Nations
être modifiées par la
and
force.
international
Monsieur le
laws must
Président,
not be modified by force.
pour que les réunions
Mr.
diplomatiques
President,
aboutissent,
for diplomatic encounters to
la
bear
paix
fruit
appelle une
peace
volonté politique sincère.
requires sincere political will.
La grande majorité de la
have
communauté
that.
internationale l'a.
The overwhelming majority of
L'Ukraine
the international
Seule la
community
Russie
has
continue
that.
de vouloir la guerre.
Ukraine
Ces
has
manœuvres
it.
diplomatiques
Russia
dilatoires
alone
ne trompent
continues to
personne.
wage the war.
Nous devons
Its
continuer d'agir
delaying diplomatic
pour la
maneuvers
contraindre à
are
la paix.
misleading nobody. We
Je vous
must
remercie.
act to prompt it, to compel it, to bring about peace. Thank you.
Well, merci beaucoup, and I thank the representative of France for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Saludamos a las altas autoridades
We
y
welcome
distinguidos
the high
representantes
authorities and
de los
distinguished
países que nos
representatives
distinguen con
of
su
the
participación.
countries that distinguished
Las
us today with
declaraciones de la
their honor
secretaria
us with
general
their
adjunta,
participation. The
Rosemary
statement by
DiCarlo,
the
una
Undersecretary
vez
General
más,
Rosemary DiCarlo once
ponen de
again
relieve
highlights
las
the
devastadoras
devastating
consecuencias
consequences of the conflict
y reafirman
and
la
reaffirms
necesidad
the
de
need
ponerle fin.
to bring an end to it.
Panamá también ha reiterado de manera constante
Panama, too,
este
has
mismo
constantly
mensaje.
reiterated
Y
this
una
same
vez más,
message and once again
reafirma hoy
reaffirms
su urgente llamado
today its
a un
urgent
cese al
call
fuego.
for a ceasefire.
A 4 años del conflicto en
4
Ucrania,
years into the conflict in
reunimos
Ukraine,
nuevamente
we meet
para
again
intentar
to attempt to
atender
address
los profundos
the
efectos
profound
de hechos que
effects
representan
of
un
events
quiebre
that represent a
sustancial
substantial
del orden
rupture
internacional.
of the international
Al
order
recurrirse
through
una vez más
the
al uso de la
recourse once
fuerza
again to
por
the
encima
use
de
of
los principios
force
consagrados
above
en
the
la Carta de
principles
las Naciones
enshrined
Unidas.
in the Charter of the United Nations.
Este conflicto trascendió
The
con
effects
rapidez
of
su
this
geografía
conflict were
inmediata.
quickly felt outside
No
its
solo
immediate
impacta de
geography.
manera directa
It has not
a
only
Europa,
had a direct
reconfigurando
impact on
alianzas
Europe,
y
reconfiguring
acelerando procesos
alliances
de
and
rearme
speeding up rearmament
sus secuelas
processes.
se proyectan
In
también a
addition, its
escala global.
consequences are felt at a global level.
Inestabilidad energética,
Energy instability,
inseguridad
food
alimentaria
insecurity,
y disrupción
and
de la seguridad
disruptions
marítima.
to maritime security.
Asimismo, el conflicto
Furthermore,
volvió a
the
situar
conflict has once again focused international attention on dynamics from an era of marked bipolarity that seemed to have been overcome at the end of the last century. The transgression of the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the prohibition on the use of force stopped being a historical discussion, altering current normative frameworks. On the ground, missiles and drones have not let up, and increasing technological sophistication of the war, together with the proliferation of weapons, have fueled the conflict and have increased the loss of life. The strength demonstrated by civilians, the main victims of this war, should not be normalized. Their suffering, consequence of geopolitics, is suffering enough. Furthermore, the figures of fallen soldiers, reportedly approaching some 2 million, also bear out the magnitude and severity of the conflict. The humanitarian work of the United Nations agencies and other organizations cannot be sustained indefinitely. It is essential to reiterate that respect for international humanitarian law means guaranteeing humane conditions for prisoners of war, in caring for the sick and the seriously wounded, and ensuring repatriation wherever possible. Furthermore, the search for the missing must remain a high humanitarian priority for all parties. In this context, it is essential to guarantee that the International Committee of the Red Cross can have regular and unhindered access to all those detained on both sides of the front, in accordance with the Third Geneva Convention. Equally essential is to ensure that the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has free and safe access to both sides of the front line, particularly in the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Furthermore, the war in Ukraine continues to have a devastating impact on children. Thousands of minors have died or been wounded, and millions remain displaced or continue to have limited access to basic services. We continue to hear worrisome reports of the forced transfers and family separations, hindering reunification, which must be duly clarified. The protection of children permits no ambiguity. It is a legal, humanitarian, and moral obligation. President, it is not viable to sustain platforms for dialogue while the aggression continues and while we continue to see the conflict fueled through weapons and other resources. This not only worsens human suffering, but further weakens the international system. For this reason, we recognize the diplomatic efforts made by different international actors and the initiative of the United States for a sustainable peace in Ukraine that has been visible through the recent meetings in Abu Dhabi and Geneva that we hope will continue to develop so that we can put a full stop to a conflict that should not carry on anymore. Panama reaffirms its commitment to the principles of multilateralism and to peace. And we refuse to let mistrust, the preponderance of force to become the norm. For this reason, we support Resolution 2774 of 2025 of this Council and all diplomatic efforts to bring an end to the conflict, fully in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, and I thank the representative of Panama for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo, for your briefing. 4 long, brutal years have passed since the Russia-Ukraine war escalated to its current horrific scale, resulting in thousands of casualties, men, women, children, soldiers, and civilians. This war must end immediately. Colleagues, today we also mark the 1-year anniversary of the adoption by this Council of Resolution 2774, which implored a swift end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict and a lasting peace between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. That call has obviously not yet been heeded. Under President Trump's leadership, the United States continues to push for a negotiated and durable end to the war. Military force will never resolve this conflict. Only a diplomatic solution, agreed to by both sides, can do so. We are closer to a deal right now than at any point since the war began, but we have obviously not reached it yet. The fighting continues. Bombs are still falling in Ukraine, hitting energy infrastructure and leaving thousands of homes without light or heat in the depths of winter. But make no mistake, President Trump is committed to peace prevailing. His actions, public statements, and global leadership mission makes clear his determination to put an end to the carnage. Under one reason why the conflict continues to grind on, in spite of the staggering costs it has already meant for Russia, is the support that Russia continues to receive from third countries. China remains the decisive enabler of Russia's war industrial machine. We have urged China many times in this chamber to stop supplying Russia with dual-use goods and material components that end up in the drones and other weapons used in Ukraine. China also remains one of the top importers of Russian oil. If China truly wants peace, it should immediately end exports of dual-use goods and stop purchasing Russian oil. The DPRK has transferred munitions and ballistic missiles to Russia for use in Ukraine, and since October 2024 has deployed thousands of DPRK troops to fight for Russia on the front lines. These activities not only prolong the war, they violate the UN Security Council resolutions that Russia itself voted for. Resolutions 1718, 1874, and 2270 collectively prohibit UN member states from receiving arms and related materiel, training, or assistance from or providing them to the DPRK. Iran has supplied Russia with hundreds of UAVs and UAV technology for use in Ukraine, including transfers before October 2023 in violation of Security Council Resolution 2231. More recently, Cuba has emerged as another significant contributor of foreign troops to Russia. In 2025, Cuba has also signed new defense agreements with Russia and Belarus. The United States calls on all UN member states to end any and all support that enables the continuation of this deplorable war, which extracts a devastating human toll and threatens peace and security around the world. We call on all countries to join us in our efforts to encourage a negotiated, durable peace that will restore prosperity, security, and a bright future for everyone around the globe. Most urgently, we once again call on both parties to stay at the negotiating table and, in a spirit of flexibility, compromise in a duty to protect and preserve the lives of their own citizens, to end this barbaric war once and for all. Mr. President, I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statements, and I now give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Transmito mi agradecimiento a la subsecretaria general para Asuntos
the
Políticos
Undersecretary General
y de
for
Consolidación
Political
de
and
Paz por su
Peacebuilding
completo y
Affairs. I
sensible
thank her
reporte.
for her
Saludo
very
asimismo
full
a las
briefing.
delegaciones
I
que nos
also
acompañan
convey
en la
my
sesión de
greetings
hoy.
to the delegations
Señor
joining us
presidente,
today.
me dirijo
Mr.
hoy ante
President,
este consejo con
I
inmensa
address
tristeza por
this
las
council today
consecuencias
with
devastadoras de la
immense
guerra en Ucrania.
sadness regarding the
Tras
devastating
4 años
consequences
de
of the war in Ukraine.
enfrentamientos,
After 4
el
years
sufrimiento
of
humano continúa
confrontations, human
acumulándose
suffering continues to rise alarmingly, leaving devastating consequences on the battlefield and affecting the lives of millions of people. We profoundly lament the loss of human lives. Every figure means a life affected. Today, as we mark 4 years of sustained violence, we recall and we pay particular tribute to the civilian victims, children that have seen their childhood interrupted, women carrying the weight of displacement and uncertainty, older persons who have lost their homes and their support, persons with disabilities whose vulnerability has been worsened, and humanitarian workers who are risking their lives to assist others. To all of the victims and to their relatives, we express our solidarity, our empathy, and our respect. The impact is not only material. The reports on the harm to civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, electrical networks, water and sanitation systems all confirm that critical systems for survival have been affected. And this is therefore key to recall that international humanitarian law is not optional nor selective. It is a fundamental obligation falling on all UN member states, including the members of this Council. Mr. President, on the basis of the principles of the Charter and international law, we have built dialogue and understanding between our countries. It is not time to abandon these basic principles. On the contrary, it is in the worst times of war when we need to stick to the most essential, the protection of life, the human dignity, and the civilian population. Respecting the principle of distinction, proportionality, precaution in hostilities is an abstract aspiration, not be an abstract aspiration. Therefore, we reiterate our call for safe, rapid, unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need. Humanitarian agencies and organizations working on the ground must be able to carry out their work on a continuous, predictable basis. It's essential to preserve humanitarian action based on the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality and independence. These principles should not be instrumentalized or subject to conditions. They represent the foundation that generates trust and allows us to reach those most in need. Further, Colombia reiterates the staunch call to protect humanitarian personnel. Attacking or threatening those providing assistance is a serious violation of international law. It undermines the very possibility of relieving suffering. Protecting humanitarian workers means, therefore, protecting communities that they serve. President, we welcome the ongoing efforts for dialogue. Colombia has consistently reiterated that channels of communication must be kept open and operational, including and particularly in contexts of high tension. We welcome the meetings held on the 17th and 18th of February. We hope that these conversations will be continued and will be substantive, particularly always including the interested parties. It's further fundamental that all of these discuss humanitarian aspects, not as a condition, but rather as an integral and essential part of the process. In this context, we underscore the importance of addressing the issue of prisoners of war, detained civilians, and the missing. Humanitarian efforts must and can generate trust and alleviate suffering, while we also work on specific policies. Colombia reiterates once again, President, the appeal for a ceasefire. Silencing the weapons is an essential precondition to curbing the immediate suffering and opening true space for negotiation and a path to peace. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, and I thank the representative of Colombia for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I thank USG DiCarlo for her comprehensive briefing. What began 4 years ago has now entered yet another difficult chapter, with consequences that continue to ripple far beyond its borders. My delegation remains profoundly concerned by the continued deterioration of situation and security and humanitarian situation. The ongoing hostilities serve only to prolong suffering and further diminish prospects for sustainable peace. We are deeply troubled by the continuous escalation of attacks affecting civilian areas and essential infrastructure. The protection of civilians, particularly the most vulnerable, and the preservation of critical infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and homes, are non-negotiable obligations enshrined in international law. Somalia reiterates that all parties to the conflict must respect and uphold these principles without exception. Mr. President, we remain convinced that there is no military solution to this protracted conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the sole means to bring about an end to this conflict. We note with encouragement the ongoing diplomatic initiatives to achieve a comprehensive ceasefire. We also welcome the recent diplomatic efforts led by the United States, including the third round of trilateral talks, which took place last week in Geneva. These encouragements represent vital steps toward de-escalation, and we hope they lay the groundwork for a constructive path forward. We call upon all sides to prioritize de-escalation, exercise utmost restraint, and commit to genuine, immediate negotiations. It's incumbent upon all parties to respect international law and to prevent a wider conflagration. A durable resolution must address the underlying root causes of this conflict and be consistent with the principles of the United Nations Charter. We underscore that just and lasting peace will require compromise and confidence-building measures. In closing, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a resolution that restores security and stability. The people of Ukraine and all of those affected by this conflict deserve a future of peace, prosperity, and dignity. I thank you.
Well, I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Thank you. Mr. President, Liberia approaches today's discussion not with theoretical detachment, but with lived memory of painful scars. Our own war was internal. Ukraine's is international. The causes may differ, but the suffering is the same. In every conflict, ordinary people form the unwilling front lines, mothers whispering lullabies in basements, children learning the sounds of drones before school bells, and persons with disability facing barriers, not only of mobility, but of survival. Hospitals turn into targets, power plants into ruins, water into scarcity, and hope into fragility. This council was not established to manage wars. It was created to prevent them. Liberia, therefore, unequivocally reaffirms the principles of the United Nations Charter: respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and the prohibition of the use of force. These are not ceremonial words. They are the load-bearing pillars of our international order. When they crack, the entire structure trembles. From Monrovia's own history, we learn a simple but profound truth. War is loud and consuming. Peace is patient and rebuilding, brick by brick. When guns fell silent in Liberia, classrooms reopened, markets revived, roads replaced roadblocks, and former fighters became farmers, teachers, and entrepreneurs. The dividend of peace is not poetic. It is profoundly practical. It feeds families, restores dignity, and gives nations a future. We commend the sustained efforts of the United Nations, humanitarian agencies, regional bodies, and member states to alleviate suffering and promote de-escalation. These efforts matter, but compassion must be matched by courage. Liberia underscores three key imperatives. First, the protection of civilians must move from rhetoric to reality. Attacks on homes, schools, hospitals, and energy infrastructure must stop. Second, humanitarian access must remain unhindered, safe, and sustained. Aid delayed is aid denied. Third, vulnerable groups, women, girls, older persons, and persons with disability must not be afterthoughts, but central actors in protection and recovery strategies. Mr. President, Liberia does not pretend that peace is easy. It demands compromise, persistence, and difficult dialogue. Yet we know wars rarely end on battlefields. They end at negotiation tables. This Council must therefore promote confidence-building measures, strengthen diplomatic channels, and insist firmly and consistently on respect for international law. History will not measure us by the number of meetings we held, but by whether we chose courage over convenience, upheld principles when it was inconvenient, and stood with civilians when it was costly. Liberia appeals to the moral conscience of this Council. Choose the harder path of peace, the rule of law over the rule of force, and humanity over hubris. The people of Ukraine deserve not a managed war, but a decisive and lasting peace. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liberia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
شكرا سيد الرئيس وأحب يترأس معاليكم لهذه الجلسة.
It's an honor to see you presiding this Security Council meeting today.
سعادة السيدة روزماري ديكارلو وكيلة الأمين العام
Likewise, I would like to express my thanks to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, the Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, for her briefing, and I welcome all the participants here. Mr. President, the war in Ukraine is the most protracted conflict on European soil since the Second World War. As it enters its fifth year, military operations continue. According to the statistics of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, to date, more than 2,500 civilians have been killed in 2025 alone, making it the bloodiest year since the beginning of the conflict. Likewise, vital civilian infrastructure has suffered severe damage, having a harmful effect on the provision of essential services at a time when humanitarian needs continue to rise. In this regard, allow me to express three essential points. Firstly, the Kingdom of Bahrain once again reaffirms the importance of respecting international law, including international humanitarian law and the United Nations Charter. We must protect innocent civilians from harm in all circumstances, because civilians pay the highest price, are paying the highest price in this conflict. Second, the Kingdom of Bahrain welcomes all efforts made to bring an end to the war in Ukraine through diplomacy, dialogue, and negotiations, and to curb the humanitarian effects of this conflict, as well as those to enhance stability and security in Europe and to achieve a just, comprehensive, lasting peace and prosperity at the regional level. The Kingdom of Bahrain also stresses the importance of efforts to maintain ongoing negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, including those undertaken by His Excellency, the President of the United States, Mr. Donald Trump. These latest efforts were the last round of negotiations held in Geneva. Likewise, the Kingdom of Bahrain commends the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and we thank them for hosting the talks between the Russian Federation, the United States of America, and the United States of America on the Ukrainian crisis. At the same time, we thank the United Arab Emirates for hosting the trilateral meetings between the UAE, the United States, and Russia with Ukraine in Abu Dhabi. These are constructive, positive efforts under the framework of diplomatic and humanitarian initiatives to find a peaceful resolution to the Ukrainian crisis. Further, the Kingdom welcomes mediation efforts made by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which led to the release of detainees and prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine. And we also applaud the efforts of the UAE. These led to an exchange involving 507 parties, including a total of 314 prisoners from both sides, bringing the total number of prisoners exchanged through these mediations to 4,955. Further, we welcome the mediation efforts made by the State of Qatar, including in family reunification for families in both Russia and Ukraine, contributing to alleviating human suffering. Third, the Kingdom of Bahrain reaffirms the need to continue diplomatic efforts to keep channels of dialogue open between both sides. All stakeholders must be constructively engaged in these efforts to strengthen initiatives to build peace and stability on the European continent and to promote understanding and coexistence. Likewise, we should address the root causes of the conflict and carefully respond to the security concerns of all sides to reach a lasting solution to the crisis. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain reaffirms its support for the efforts to reach a sustainable, peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine in accordance with the principles of international law, the United Nations Charter, and Resolution 2774 of the Security Council, so as to strengthen international peace and security. Thank you very much.
Well, I thank the representative of Bahrain for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing. 4 years into the Ukraine crisis, the situation has come to a critical juncture. Recently, key stakeholders have conducted multiple rounds of engagement. With the deepening negotiation process, calls for peace have grown stronger, and the prospect for a political solution is now on the horizon. On the other hand, we witness continued hostilities, rising civilian casualties, and a deeply worrying humanitarian situation. The more critical the moment, the more imperative it is to strengthen confidence and intensify efforts. China proposes the following. First, firmly promote a political settlement. History has repeatedly shown that military means cannot deliver lasting peace, and that any conflict must ultimately be resolved through negotiations. The Ukraine crisis is no exception. At present, although differences persist among the positions of the main parties, all acknowledge the overarching direction of a political settlement and the aspiration to reach a comprehensive, lasting, and binding peace agreement. This is a valuable consensus and an objective we should all strive for. We call on the parties concerned to seize the positive momentum, demonstrate political will, continue to build consensus, and work towards the political settlement and a lasting peace. Second, firmly safeguard collective security. This crisis shows that security is mutual. One country's security cannot be built on the insecurity of others, and regional security cannot be ensured by strengthening or even expanding military blocs. For Russia, Ukraine, and all European countries who are inseparable neighbors, living in harmony is the only realistic option. We call on relevant parties to discard the Cold War mentality and the bloc confrontation, to exercise the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and to respect and address each other's legitimate security concerns, and to work towards building a balanced, effective, and sustainable regional security architecture. Third, firmly manage and control the spillover effect. The ongoing spillover of the crisis has further weighed on the global economy already under considerable strain. We call on the international community to work together and strengthen cooperation on issues such as food, energy, finance, trade, and the protection of critical infrastructure to ensure a stable and unimpeded global supply chain. We oppose the politicization and instrumentalization of the global economy and the abuse of unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction, as such actions are counterproductive and may even create new problems. President, China maintains a consistent position on the Ukraine issue, guided by the four shoes put forward by President Xi Jinping. Namely, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to a peaceful resolution of the crisis should be supported, all of which hold significant practical relevance in the current complex international landscape. Over the past 4 years, with an objective and impartial stance, China has worked tirelessly for peace and promoted dialogue and negotiations. We've maintained close communication with Russia, Ukraine, and other relevant parties. We've sent a special envoy to conduct shuttle diplomacy, and together with Brazil and other global South countries, launched the Group of Friends for Peace on the Ukraine crisis. In a continued effort to garner consensus and advance peace efforts, China stands ready to work with the international community to play a constructive role in achieving an early political settlement of the crisis. President, the statement just made by the U.S. representative once again smeared and vilified China, which is completely unacceptable. China is not the creator of the Ukraine crisis, nor is it a party to the conflict. China's position on Ukraine has been open and consistent from the start, namely calling for a ceasefire and an end to the fighting and promoting peace talks. The international community can see clearly China's efforts. We've not provided lethal weapons to any party to the conflict, and we have consistently exercised strict controls over dual-use items. As a major economy of manufacturing, trading, and consumption, China maintains normal economic and trade relations with Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and European countries. These exchanges follow market and commercial principles, do not violate Security Council resolutions, and are beyond reproach. China will, based on its own national interests, adopt reasonable energy security measures. I also want to stress that for some time, the U.S. has fabricated all sorts of excuses and lies in various settings and has continued to attack and smear China. This is explicit political manipulation. Its purpose is to incite, block confrontation, and create division and conflict. We once again urge the U.S. to stop deflecting attention, stop shifting blame, and stop creating conflicts and wars around the world. Thank you, President.
Well, I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Thank you, President.
Thank you, USG Rosemary DiCarlo. Thank you for your briefing, which sheds additional light on the humanitarian consequences of the crisis in Ukraine. President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, reiterates its deep concern in light of the ongoing deterioration of the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. 4 long years have gone by since this conflict began. 4 years characterized by significant losses of human life, destruction of critical infrastructure, and a daily ordeal for civilians. The DRC reiterates that there cannot be a military solution to this conflict. Only a solution underpinned by diplomacy and dialogue with full respect for the principles of international law, international humanitarian law, and the United Nations Charter can pave the way for a definitive cessation of this tragedy, which everyone wants to see end. On this note, my country welcomes the efforts undertaken by international partners, as well as the diplomatic initiatives underway, including that led by the USA. We also applaud the parties' commitment to opt for de-escalation and dialogue, as demonstrated by the recent meetings held in Geneva on 17th and 18th February. The DRC calls for all actors to exercise wisdom and to avoid engaging in any unilateral actions which could disrupt the peace process underway. We believe it would be judicious to maintain this momentum so as to avoid any obstacles which may stand in the way of a comprehensive, fair, and lasting solution. Mr. President, Ukraine is today one of the most painful symbols of civilians' vulnerability in times of war. As the harsh winter wears on, millions of people remain deprived of access to electricity, heating, and drinking water. The DRC unswervingly reiterates that the protection of civilians must remain a top priority for us. I'd like to recall that mechanisms such as the Ukrainian Humanitarian Fund and the Winter Response Plan 2025-2026 allowed for vital assistance to be provided to 1.7 million vulnerable people. Nonetheless, these efforts, although they're absolutely essential, they remain insufficient given the scale of need. There's therefore a pressing and important need to step up humanitarian assistance, all the while guaranteeing safe and unfettered access and ensuring that protection is afforded to critical civilian infrastructure. President, it's important to underscore that the cross-border repercussions of this conflict, which is having direct consequences for global food security, is a serious problem. Disruptions to the production and export of grain are hitting very hard certain regions which are already fragile, in particular Africa, where millions of people depend on these imports in order to be able to feed themselves and to meet their very basic nutritional needs. This crisis tragically illustrates the inextricable link between armed conflict, hunger, and instability. As recalled by the Executive Director of the World Food Programme, most people suffering from acute food insecurity today live in conflict-affected areas. Hunger is becoming a silent weapon, hitting the poorest and the most vulnerable. It is precisely to address such situations that the Security Council adopted Resolution 2417 in 2018, reiterating the Council's responsibility in preventing famine and food insecurity linked to armed conflict. This responsibility is not theoretical. It is moral, political, it is a human responsibility. Mr. President, drawing on our unfortunate experience and well aware of the human cost of protracted conflict, the DRC reiterates our unswerving commitment to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter: the sovereign equality of states, the respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and abstaining from any form of coercion that is incompatible with the principles and purposes of our organization. I thank you.
Donc, merci beaucoup, and I thank the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Under-Secretary General DiCarlo for her briefing. We echo the calls for bringing this conflict to an early end, for peace to return and prevail in the region. Your presiding over this session, Mr. President, and the high-level representation in the chamber underscores the importance of the occasion. As we mark this solemn milestone, we must look back at how 4 years of conflict not only ruptured the peace in the region, but sent shockwaves across the world, also undermining food and energy security, especially impacting the global south. President, the toll from this conflict, especially the humanitarian catastrophe that it unleashed, is devastating and undeniable. Thousands of lives lost or forever changed, generations scarred, cities and safe areas turned into uninhabitable spaces. The rising human suffering is deeply concerning. The disproportionate impact on civilians and critical infrastructure remains a perturbing reality, jolting the very foundations of international humanitarian law. These actions, besides perpetuating the conflict, further deepen distrust, reduce space for meaningful dialogue, and undermine peace efforts. President, last year, on this very day, this Council adopted Resolution 2774, which was also supported by Pakistan, making a clarion call imploring both parties to silence the guns and chart a course towards peace. A few months later, in July, the Council reaffirmed its support for peaceful settlement of disputes through unanimous adoption of Resolution 2788. These were moments of collective hope, and therefore it is a matter of profound regret that the demand from this Council has remained largely unheeded. Yet we remain hopeful of a breakthrough for peace. From the very first days of this conflict, Pakistan has stood on the side of dialogue and diplomacy. Our position is born of conviction that there is no military solution to this conflict. A just and lasting peace can only be achieved through sustained, structured, and meaningful dialogue. We supported this back in 2022 when the two sides were holding dialogue in Istanbul, and we continue to support all subsequent peace initiatives, including the ongoing negotiations process facilitated by the United States. We hope that all sides will make full use of the ongoing diplomacy, demonstrate genuine political will, show mutual understanding, and engage constructively to make meaningful strides towards a peaceful and negotiated settlement of the conflict, beginning with an early ceasefire. This would require commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, a focus on finding a mutually acceptable solution that ensures the security interests of all sides and thus guarantees lasting stability for the region and beyond. It would also entail avoiding pointing fingers elsewhere. The imperative to end the agony of millions is not just a political objective, it is a profound moral responsibility. Pakistan favors all genuine efforts aimed at a comprehensive and durable resolution of this conflict. We will continue to support all initiatives aimed at bridging the divide and promoting a pacific settlement. It it is time to prove that diplomacy and dialogue are not a sign of weakness, but essential and powerful means in our collective quest for peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President,
if
to speak formally, I'm a Ukrainian. And I have a strange last name. Some it's difficult to find it even in Ukraine. It is from the Zaporozhye Kazakhs. My father is a pure Ukrainian, was a pure Ukrainian, as was my mother from the Kazakhs, and from the Shiraz Panibets and Eve Panibennik. But for us, there's no difference here. We are all one. Millions of Ukrainians in Russia, millions of Russians in Ukraine, in Belarus as well. We are, and you yourselves are perfectly aware of this, and this is not the point. Nationality is something which is shared. The faiths differ. There is a Kiev Rusi, which you sold cheaply for 30 Serberniks. The Great Patriotic War, during that war, my father, Ukrainian, went to fight in Leningrad for his country, for his homeland. He signed himself up for a year to be a volunteer, and during that year he spent his entire life. He pretended to be older, and we had a common homeland then. What have you transformed your current homeland into? And this is something which almost nobody here understands, nor can they even begin to understand. We then fought together against the Nazis, and today we are fighting alone, without you, without those who you have transformed into Nazis, for the people of Ukraine, for them not to become the same. Yes, this has been ongoing for 4 years. Yes, I am not happy about the fact that people are dying, but if need be, this will continue for as long as necessary for you no longer to brainwash these people. European Council members convene this meeting, which has nothing to do either with the maintenance of international peace and security, nor has it anything to do with the concern which is mentioned about civilians in Ukraine and the plight thereof. European countries clearly are not focused on supporting the current trilateral negotiations, which are geared towards seeking a lasting and long-term solution to the Ukrainian crisis. They have no concern for the future of the Ukrainian people either. And this was fully borne out during the Munich conference, which was held a little bit over a week ago. What did the leaders of the majority of European countries talk about there? Those of the EU and of NATO. They talked about arming Europe, bolstering the eastern flank, its preparations for war, with references to the history and the geography of their country. German Chancellor Merz announced his willingness to once again become the leader of Europe, stating, we will make the Bundeswehr the strongest conventional army in Europe as soon as possible. One wonders how many European countries with smaller scale geopolitical ambitions questions about where precisely this Bundeswehr will bring them. The Keir Starmer, not to be outdone by the German warlord, prospects for war for him are already nigh, and he is ready for warfare. He also recalled history, and the Prime Minister added that European security is impossible without Britain. Similarly, about the importance of Anglo-German relations for Europe was mentioned by the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain upon his return from the 1938 Munich conference. What this ultimately wrought, incling for the United Kingdom itself, is well known to all, I believe. The current European leaders, without any, having cast aside their masks, without any reservations, are announcing that they're banking on inflicting strategic defeat upon the Russian Federation, and their domestic and foreign policy is being made subordinate to this, as is the economy of the entire European Union. And clearly, peace in Ukraine was not mentioned in any of those statements. Against this backdrop, there have been hysterical statements. Hysterical statements were uttered in Munich by Zelensky. Money for continuing the war continues to be allocated, but there is less of it, and there are promises about weapons being supplied. But this does not mean that this is slowly being written off. Europe clearly is willing to provide security assurances to Ukraine only so long as the Kiev regime remains an enemy of the Russian Federation, continues to wage the war. Zelensky does not need peace. He directly stated this in Munich. For him, war is a matter of politics and merely a matter of pure physical survival. Mr. President, Western countries, first and foremost European countries, are playing a very unseemly role, and they have been doing so from the very start of the Ukrainian crisis. Recently, we have marked the latest anniversary of the coup in Kiev. I would recall that the Europeans in 2013 to 2014 carried out an unprecedented intervention into the domestic affairs of Ukraine, which indeed caused the anti-constitutional ouster of the legitimately elected president of Ukraine. It is indeed Europe presenting itself as a paragon and a norm setter and the source of moral standards for all others. As they say, not always civilized and frequently the authoritarian world. They are the ones who brought to power in Ukraine the brutal regime of a neo-Nazi ilk, giving this regime carte blanche for any crimes and effectively encouraging its single-minded focus on the destruction of the Russian language population. There have been no words of condemnation from Western sponsors for these blood-curdling attacks targeting civilians in first Donbass and in other Russian cities. For 12 years, we spoke in this chamber about the use of air assets and heavy equipment and arms targeting women, children, the elderly, in peaceful Donbass cities, the burning of people alive in Odessa, the persecution and the murder of dissenters, and the war being waged against the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We were met with intonations about countering separatism and legality of the so-called counterterrorism operation, when the magnitude of the crimes perpetrated by the Kyiv regime went beyond what anybody could have imagined, and the entire Western military arsenal was brought to counter this, our special military operation began. Since then, Western premises placed at their heart these following words: unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. Anybody who tries to speak the truth about the lawlessness being carried out in Donbass and the present-day strikes targeting civilian objects and civilians in Russian cities, the brutal Kursk operations, and moreover to present evidence about the conflict having been unleashed and provoked precisely by NATO, immediately these are being written off as pro-Russian propaganda, and they are being silenced. In Ukraine, such people are being expelled from the country. They are being placed in prisons where they languish, or they're being simply murdered. I turned to Ukrainian colleagues. Who are you looking to deceive? Contrary to the facts, contrary to common sense, for all of these years, you have been casting Zelensky as a hero. You have been highlighting peaceful aspirations, of which he never had any, while at the same time mendaciously accusing the Russian Federation of having no interest in peace and of having a focus on escalation. Any attempts by European leaders to persuade the world about their commitment to achievement of peace in Ukraine collapse when they are faced with the facts. Today, on the 24th of February, the Press Bureau, the Domestic Intelligence Services of the Russian Federation, published an extraordinary report about the plans of London and Paris to deliver to Kyiv nuclear weapons, or the so-called dirty bomb, as well as the means of delivery. Specifically, we are talking about the clandestine handover to Ukraine of the corresponding European parts, equipment, and technology as an option. What is considered is the French compact TN-75 warhead for the M51.1 submarine-launched ballistic missile. It is telling that other Western capitals, by all accounts, are perfectly cognizant of the magnitude of the recklessness of London and Paris. For example, Berlin has refused to take part in this initiative. I do not think it bears recalling that such ideas and plans are not only reckless and dangerous, but they are also illegal insofar as they constitute a direct breach of Article 1 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And for this precise reason, those who are carrying out and who have devised this misadventure are striving to present Kyiv's gaining access to nuclear weapons as the result of the work of the Ukrainians themselves. Such a turn of events clearly shows that the British and French leaders who have been sidelined in the process of resolving the Ukrainian issue have definitively lost touch with reality. Russia has every opportunity and is fully able to rebuff such acts. However, we do still hope that there are still enough reasonable people with common sense in London and Paris who will manage to refrain, to have their leaders refrain from undertaking such inadequate steps. Unfortunately, the United Nations Secretary General is playing an unworthy role in resolving the Ukrainian crisis. Not only did he categorically take a side in the conflict, relinquishing an opportunity vested to him by the United Nations to objectively contribute to resolution thereof, but he continues to remain obstinate, arbitrarily interpreting the Charter of the United Nations and other key documents of the United Nations in order to create a pseudo-legal basis under the inapplicability for Donbass of the right to self-determination. And the Secretariat at the same time continues to turn a blind eye to the intention of the UAF to conduct strikes in Russia with a focus on civilian infrastructure, including terrorist attacks targeting civilians on rare occasion, eking out pitiful few syllables about Russian civilian casualties. As is well known, Mr. President, to all present, the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security is borne by the United Nations Security Council, which in Resolution 2774, which is adopted exactly 1 year ago, spoke out in favor of a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. Security councils have a legally binding nature. For this reason, all member states of the United Nations must enforce them and comply therewith. The Ukrainians and the European sponsors have a lengthy track list of perfidy and hypocrisy, beginning with the sabotage of the Minsk agreements, which according to subsequent acknowledgments by European leaders, were nothing other than an attempt to gain time to rearm the UAF. And similarly, Resolution 2202 was mere noise for them. Last year's document 2774 does not advance their interests. The leaders of the majority of European countries, as we see, believe themselves to be above Security Council resolutions and the principles and the norms of international law. This morning at the General Assembly, there was a vote on a resolution drafted by Kyiv and European countries entitled Support for Lasting Peace in Ukraine. This is yet another manipulation, an attempt to create a smokescreen before the eyes of the global south. This resolution has nothing to do with reality, nor does it advance a lasting resolution to the conflict. Mr. President, from the very start of the conflict, we stated that for us, diplomatic methods for the achievement of the goals of the special military operation are preferred. In this connection, we value the position that has been embraced by the U.S. administration and Mr. Trump personally. Russia has been conscientiously and in good faith approaching the trilateral negotiations, participating therein, as well as in discussions in Abu Dhabi and Geneva. But any agreement needs to be comprehensive, take into account our concerns on the root causes of the conflict, and needs to result in a real end to this conflict, rather than an ephemeral ceasefire which the Kyiv regime will exploit for their aggressive purposes. The principled approaches of the Russian Federation vis-à-vis the resolution of the Ukrainian crisis were voiced by President Putin in June of 2024. I would recall we are talking about Ukraine's respect for the rights of the Russian language population, its return to a non-bloc, neutral, non-nuclear basis which is enshrined in the 16 July 1990 Declaration on its state sovereignty, the demilitarization and the denazification of Ukraine, as well as recognition of the status of Crimea, Sevastopol, Donetsk, Lugansk People's Republic, Kherson, and Zaporozhye Oblast in accordance with the will of their residents as constituent territories of the Russian Federation. I wish to recall, in conclusion, another statement from President Putin about the fact that the Russian Federation has no intention to wage war with European countries. But if Europe starts a war, then Russia stands ready. You have a choice. Reconsider your reckless embrace of the escalation of confrontation with the Russian Federation, or cease being led by the logic of war to the last Ukrainian and torpedoing at all costs the negotiations which are underway. Peace, where crimes being perpetrated on the grounds of Nazism are covered up, and devotees of this ideology and support for this ideology is being used as a tool for the advancement of geopolitical interests will sooner or later plunge us into chaos. And the lessons of history in this context carry direct significance. Thank you.
Well, I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I shall now make a further statement in my capacity as Minister of State for Europe, North America, and Overseas Territories of the United Kingdom. I need to say to members of this Council that the allegation made by the representative of the Russian Federation is an outright lie. He says that we have lost touch with reality. It is he who has lost touch with reality. This is yet another piece of disinformation from the Russian Federation and a clear attempt to deflect attention from its ongoing, unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine. I can categorically assure members of this Council that the United Kingdom remains fully committed to its obligations under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and to preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We are not providing and would not provide nuclear weapons or related capabilities to Ukraine. And I resume my function as President of the Council, and the representative of France has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. President, France would like to align itself with the statement you made regarding the allegations leveled by the Russian Federation, according to which France and the UK are preparing to transfer a nuclear weapon to Ukraine. This allegation is a gross violation. It's an attempt at disinformation. They constitute a lie, pure and simple, devoid of any factual basis. France is a responsible member or party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We will never violate its contours nor its obligations. Who but Russia? Which is brandishing the nuclear threat, and it's been doing this in this conflict for 4 years now. Who but Russia is covering up its proliferation maneuvers, including that of the DPRK? Who but Russia is lending its support to Iran, lending its support to Iran's nuclear activities, the civilian nature of which has never been proven? I would like to repeat what I said. Russia's allegations are gross. But let me go a little further than that and to recall that the keynote address of the permanent representative of the Russian Federation demonstrates how difficult it is for Russia to accept the very existence of an Ukrainian nation, to accept the independence, the sovereignty of Ukraine, to accept that Ukraine wants to be its own nation. I thank you.
Well, I thank the representative of France for his further statement. And now, under Rule 37, I give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Mariana Betsa, the Deputy Minister
for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, before I proceed to my statement, I would like to make also 3 remarks with regard to the statement of the Russian delegate. First, Mr. Nebenza, you're not Ukrainian and don't pretend to be. Second, we're never one nation with Russia. I will never be one nation with Russia. Ukraine is a democratic, free European country, while Russia is an aggressive state which wages aggression, terrorism, war crimes and crimes against humanity, and also genocide. And third, entire statement by Mr. Nebenza is a vivid example of manipulation, disinformation, and Russian propaganda. And I'll continue with my statement. I wish to thank the UK Presidency for convening today's meeting. I'm also grateful to the Undersecretary DiCarlo for her briefing. At the outset, I would like to express my profound gratitude to all UN member states that had voted today in the morning for the UN General Assembly resolution support for lasting peace in Ukraine just a few hours ago, on this very grim anniversary, 4 years of Russia's full-scale invasion against my country and 12 years of Russia's aggression against my country. The international community has sent a clear signal for an immediate ceasefire as a prerequisite for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. It is high time for aggressor to comply with this call. Ceasefire is a fundamental precondition for the peaceful settlement of this conflict. Mr. President, I would like to start my statement with a poem of a 10-year-old girl, Katerina, from the Donetsk region, dedicated to peace. All Ukrainian children yearn for peace to come, to live with joy upon native ground, to greet the sun, the sky, the flowers blooming bright. May war's dark shadow fade from sight. May silence settle on our Ukraine's hills. May our land shed the horrors war instills. Let long-awaited peace float our shore and stand as our protector forevermore. And this girl is only 10 years old. And this is the brutal reality where our children are living in. This is how children in Ukraine see peace on their native land, which will serve as a protector for any repetition of the horrors of war. Mr. President, the United Nations, including its Security Council, was established 80 years ago to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And here we are again, 8 decades later. Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council, has waged aggression, has waged genocide, has waged terrorism, has waged war crimes and crimes against humanity on an industrial scale every single day in Ukraine. And this is the country that has misused the Soviet permanent seat in the Council and grossly violated the Charter for decades. Today, this is not only war against Ukraine, and it is not only war against Europe. It is a war against the entire democratic world, against international-based order and against international security order, and against the principles of UN. While occupying the Council's permanent seat and claiming to be one of the guarantees of international peace and security, Russia, in fact, has become the principal destroyer. Mr. President, over 10 million people across Ukraine continue to depend on humanitarian assistance for their basic survival, access to food, water, shelter, healthcare, and electricity because of the ongoing Russian aggression. In 2025 alone, the number of deliberate aerial attacks against Ukraine's civilian targets rose dramatically. During just one recent month, Russia launched over 6,000 strike drones, approximately 5,500 guided aerial bombs, and 158 missiles of various types against Ukrainian people. It is terror directed not at armies, but at maternity wards, hospitals, apartment buildings, power plants, and buses carrying workers. It is terror meant to extinguish light, heat, and hope. Men do not fight like this. Human beings do not act to one another like this. Russia's strategy is clear. It hasn't achieved a single strategic goal on the battlefield, and therefore it wants to freeze Ukrainians and force us to capitulate. As I said today in the morning in the UNGA Hall, Ukraine will not surrender, and Ukraine will not accept peace at any price. The impact of the war on the civilian population is truly devastating. Power outages have affected over 10 million people. forcing hospitals, schools, and emergency services to operate with limited or no power. Disruptions to heating during sub-zero winter temperatures have left Ukrainians unable to maintain basic living conditions. Water shortage have deprived hundreds of thousands of people of access of safe drinking water. Economic disruption has led to the closure of businesses and essential services, deepening humanitarian crisis across the country. These acts are not incidental to hostilities. They bear the hallmarks of serious, gross violations of international humanitarian law and amount to war crimes. We count to document indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, the use of weapons in densely populated areas, summer executions, torture and ill-treatment of detainees, conflict-related sexual violence, and unlawful deportation and forcible transfer of civilians, including children. In this context, arrest warrants on Russian top officials and militaries issued by the International Criminal Court underscore that such conduct may entail individual criminal responsibility under international law. Those responsible must be held accountable. Moreover, Russia has deliberately targeted grid lines and substations essential for the reliable offset power supply of nuclear power plants, creating nuclear risks not only to Ukraine and not only to Europe. One such attack recently caused the Chernobyl nuclear power plant to lose its external power supply. Against this backdrop, the situation at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remains gravely alarming. Europe's largest nuclear facility has endured repeated losses of offset power. This leaves the plant in a state of constant and dangerous vulnerability, while Russia continues unlawful and irresponsible attempts to connect the plant to its own energy system. The international community must act decisively and without delay, including through the establishment of temporary international supervision to ensure nuclear and radiation safety, prevent further militarization, and safeguard the plant's legal status. Such measures must clearly serve one objective: the safe, lawful, and irreversible return of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to Ukraine's legitimate authority, which remains the only sustainable guarantee of nuclear security in Europe. The occupation and militarization of nuclear facilities cannot be accepted. Ukraine calls on all partners to impose comprehensive sanctions on Rosatom and to reduce cooperation with this entity wherever possible. Distinguished colleagues, resilience alone is not enough. Ukraine urgently needs both humanitarian and defense assistance to protect our people. We express our deepest gratitude to the governments and citizens of all countries providing assistance. Your support saves lives and sends a clear message to Russia that their terror will not break Ukraine. We're also deeply grateful to the United Nations agencies operating in Ukraine under very difficult conditions. Since February 2022, the UN system in Ukraine has been implementing one of its largest humanitarian operations. In January 2026, the United Nations presented a new humanitarian response plan for Ukraine for the year 2026, aimed at assisting more than 4.1 million Ukrainians. And this is precisely how the United Nations proves its relevance, even when this Council is immobilized due to the presence of the aggressor in this chamber. Mr. President, as of today, 2,000 Ukrainian children have been successfully saved from Russian control and brought back home. At the same time, we are aware of more than 20,000 Ukrainian children who have been abducted and deported by Russia in grave breach of international law. Overall, approximately 1.6 million Ukrainian children remain on the temporary occupied territory. Russia systematically subjects Ukrainian children to militarization, forcibly alters their identity, changes their citizenship status, and seeks to impose upon them a hateful ideology aimed at totally erasing their Ukrainian identity. This is a deliberate component of Russia's genocidal policy against Ukraine and Ukrainians. I urge all UN member states to contribute to implementing the recently adopted UNGA resolution on the return of Ukrainian children, in particular by consolidating pressure on Russia. For Ukraine, the return of each and every child is moral imperative. It is a matter of justice, of identity, and of the very future of our nation. This war has brought immense suffering, not only to those killed or injured, but also to the loved ones left behind. Mothers searching for their sons, children waiting for their fathers, families living in unbearable uncertainty. Beyond this visible destruction lies another layer of agony, tens of thousands of missing persons, arbitrarily detained civilians and prisoners of war. A central obstacle to clarifying their fate is Russia's systematic practice of incommunicado detention. UN and RCSC are denied unimpeded access to places of detention. In stark contrast, Ukraine provides full access to facilities holding Russian prisoners of war and civilians in full compliance with the international humanitarian law. More than 16,000 Ukrainian civilians are currently held in Russian captivity. The independent International Commission of Inquiry has conducted that enforced disappearances form part of coordinated Russian state policy and amount to crimes against humanity. Russia's treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilians equally violates every tenet of international criminal and humanitarian law. Russia systematically denies prisoner of war status, subjects them to sham trial based on coerced confessions, and prosecutes them merely for defending their own country. International monitoring missions and investigation teams document arbitrary executions, widespread torture, and inhuman detention conditions, including severe beatings, electric shocks, and denial of medical care. A particularly horrifying dimension concerns conflict-related sexual violence against Ukrainian prisoners of war. The crime prompted the Secretary General to issue a specific notice regarding Russia's treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war in his 2025 CRVC report. Only the awareness of the inevitability of punishment can compel Russia, other violators, and potential aggressors to comply with international humanitarian law. Ukraine remains ready to proceed with the exchange of prisoners of war on the principle of all for all. We also called for increased international pressure on the Russian Federation to compel it to release all illegally detained civilians and abducted children. Mr. President, Ukraine continues to defend itself against Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal full-scale military invasion in full accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. Russia can end this war at any time. However, the only way to bring this about is to make Russia bear the full burden of its aggression. The cost of aggression should rise. This should also include actions with regard to new alliances forming around Russia, Iran, the DPRK, and Belarus, united by the contempt for the rule-based international order. The Russian regime and its accomplices will not stop by its own. Russia feels impunity, and it hasn't yet faced proper consequences for its atrocities. Mr. President, despite ongoing peace efforts led by the United States and supported by European partners, Russian Federation continues to show no readiness in stopping this aggression, using the negotiation process as a cover to continue this war of aggression, betting on time. As of today, we have held a number of trilateral meetings with the US and Russian sides. The last took place in Geneva on 17th, 18th February. As of today, we have no agreement on the most sensitive political matters. Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated full constructive engagement into the peace process. Ukraine is not an obstacle to peace. We want peace more than anyone else. But of course, it should be just peace. Ukraine is ready to make compromises and already said that we are ready to agree to the cessation of hostilities along the current line of context. It is a very difficult compromise for us, but we cannot compromise our sovereignty and territorial integrity. Yet the Kremlin's position remains unchanged. It wants Ukraine to withdraw from our own sovereign territory to ensure that Russia can occupy it. And this is not a matter of negotiating red lines. Sovereignty and territorial integrity is a key founding principle of the UN Charter. It is a red line for Ukraine, and I'm more than sure for every country present in this hall. Mr. President, while Russia continues its war, we must mobilize all possible resources to stop the aggressor and uphold international law. First, sanctions. Sanctions are not a magic solution, but they're essential and they're efficient. They must be strengthened to impose real economic sanctions including targeting Russia's shadow fleet, limiting oil revenues, and restricting access to critical components of weapons production. Second, defense support. Ukraine needs additional air defense systems and modern capabilities to close out the skies and to protect our people. Third, security guarantees. Ukraine must receive credible and legally binding guarantees to prevent any future aggression. And fourth, justice. Accountability should prevail, and it must include ensuring full compensation by the aggressor for the damage, loss, and injury caused to Ukraine and its people in accordance with international law. And all those responsible, Russian military and political leadership, should be held to account. Mr. President, the question today is whether the United Nations is capable of fulfilling its core function, maintaining international peace and security. We must reaffirm that international law is not just declaratory, but a real instrument of peace. If a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace is not restored in Ukraine, if the rule of force prevails, no country will be safe. If aggression prevails, the global security system will collapse, and I'm afraid UN might collapse. Ukrainians are fighting for the right to live freely on our own land, on our own soil, in our own state, and in accordance with our own choice. We will never recognize the occupation, and we will never accept territorial concessions. We will never compromise our freedom. Our ultimate goal is comprehensive, just, and lasting peace based on UN Charter, international law, where every state can be certain that sovereignty is respected, its people are safe, and aggression and aggressor are punished. Thank you for your attention. Slava Ukraini.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Mariana Betsa for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Petr Matsinka, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity to speak here today. Today marks 4 years since the launch of the war against Ukraine. 4 years of bombarded cities and drone strikes. 4 years of divided families. 4 years of trenches, minefields, and mass graves. We are here in an institution created to protect peace, and yet for 4 years we've been watching an open aggression against a sovereign state that it seems impossible to stop. Ladies and gentlemen, once a wall stood in Europe. It separated freedom from oppression. It separated truth from propaganda. It separated the future from the past. That wall no longer stands in Berlin. It stands in Ukraine. It takes the form of the front line. It takes the form of occupied cities. It takes the form of children who learn to recognize the sound of missiles before they learn their letters. And as the US President Reagan said in his famous speech in Berlin 1987, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, I think we should send the same message to the President Putin. Mr. Putin, break down this war. This war is not just about a territory. It is about a fundamental principle, whether nations have the right to decide their own future or whether their fate is decided by the force of arms. It is about whether borders can be redrawn by tanks, whether a neighboring state can be erased from the map, whether we are returning to a world of spheres of influence and occupation. I think Ukraine is not just defending itself today. It is defending the idea that the sovereignty matters. The freedom is not a bargaining chip. That aggression must not be rewarded. My country, the Czech Republic, knows this experience. We know what it means when others decide your fate. We know that appeasing aggression doesn't bring peace, it only delays the next conflict. History teaches us a simple lesson. No occupation lasts forever, no wall stands forever, and no army can break the will of a nation that has chosen to be free. And that is why I want to speak plainly today. And I'm sorry that Mr. Nebenzia left the room, because I would like him to tell to his people, to Russian people in Moscow, to stop this war and give peace a chance. Not as a gesture of weakness, but as a step of responsibility. The world is watching you, history is watching you. And with every additional day of this war, the unnecessary bill of human suffering grows. Some say that peace is not possible, but peace always begins with a decision to stop the destruction, a decision to stop sending young men to their death, a decision to open the way for diplomacy instead of artillery. Aggression is not a sign of strength, it is an admission of fear. Ladies and gentlemen, today is not just about Ukraine, it is about the message we send to the world. Whether we say that the war pays off, or that the civilized world stands with the victims, not the aggressors. Whether we accept that the law is silent when weapons speak, or whether we can show that the values have weight. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to urge you to exhaust every diplomatic avenue in pursuit of a just and lasting peace. In this regard, I commend the US President Trump and his team for their tireless effort to bring the parties to the table. Talks, however imperfect, are infinitely preferable to alternative. The future doesn't have to belong to the trenches. It can belong to reconstruction, it can belong to cooperation, it can belong to a generation that will no longer know the sound of sirens and drones, as the representative from Liberia mentioned. But that future begins with a single decision. So please, honorable representatives from Russia, tell to your President Putin to stop the war. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Matsinka for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Michael Damianos, Minister of Energy, Commerce and Industry of Cyprus.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, Mr. President, Cyprus fully aligns with the EU statement, but I would like to make some brief remarks in my national capacity. Today marks 4 years since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We commemorate this solemn anniversary with reflection and with a clear awareness of our collective responsibility under the Charter of the United Nations. Cyprus reiterates its full and unwavering support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We support a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, firmly anchored in the principles of the UN Charter and international law. Together with the European Union and its member states, Cyprus remains committed to an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire. We call on the Russian Federation to agree to such a ceasefire, to which Ukraine has consistently expressed its readiness, and to engage in genuine and constructive negotiations. In this regard, Cyprus welcomes the ongoing diplomatic efforts aimed at ending the war, including the involvement of the United States in advancing this process. For peace to endure, it must be just. Borders must never be altered by force, not in Ukraine, not anywhere. Any settlement must fully respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and include credible security guarantees to ensure its long-term stability and ability to defend itself. Cyprus speaks from its own historical experience. As a country that has endured foreign aggression and ongoing occupation for more than 5 decades, we understand firsthand the lasting consequences of violations of international law. Since assuming the presidency of the Council of the European Union in January, Cyprus has prioritized support for Ukraine, advancing political, financial, humanitarian, and military assistance, while also supporting recovery, reconstruction, and Ukraine's European path. The upholding of the UN Charter should never be selective nor optional. It is universal and indivisible. Sustainable peace can never come at the expense of sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence. Mr. President, Cyprus will continue to stand firmly with Ukraine and its people. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Damianos for the statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Lasha Dasalia, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen. We are gathered here today to mark another tragic anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. These illegal attempts to forcefully redraw the borders of a sovereign neighbor constitute a direct assault on the international rules-based order. They represent a blatant violation of the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter and the Helsinki Final Act, and they have shattered the security architecture in Europe and beyond. Georgia unequivocally condemns the immense human suffering and widespread destruction caused by Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. In response to these grave developments, Georgia is demonstrating its full solidarity with Ukraine through consistent political and diplomatic efforts, as well as by providing substantial humanitarian assistance and supporting Ukrainians arriving to Georgia. Georgia has supported all major resolutions and initiatives adopted by leading international organizations in support of Ukraine. Mr. President, Georgia knows firsthand the consequences of occupation. Russia continues its illegal military presence in Georgia's Abkhazia and Trinwali regions, where the security, human rights, and humanitarian situation remains deeply concerning, and access for international monitoring mechanisms continues to be denied. The international community must remain united and resolute. Attempts to redraw internationally recognized borders by force must never be tolerated. Georgia understands well the price of peace and its importance for a stable and prosperous future for our region. We welcome all genuine efforts aimed at ending the war and achieving lasting peace. Mr. President, allow me to reaffirm Georgia's unwavering support for independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine with its internationally recognized borders, including its territorial waters. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Dasalia for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Arnold Kamel, Secretary General at the Federal Ministry of Defense of Austria.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, esteemed members of the Security Council, Excellencies, colleagues. As we mark the 4th year of the unprovoked and illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine by its neighbor, the Russian Federation, we are reminded that this aggression constitutes an ongoing and blatant violation of the UN Charter. It constitutes a direct attack on our international order. As our foreign minister, together with some Austrian parliamentarians, witnessed upon the visit to Ukraine last week, Ukrainians have been enduring a harsh winter under merciless drone strikes and bombardments this year. This must stop immediately. As all of you know, Austria is a militarily neutral country, but neutrality has never meant indifference. It also does not mean moral ambiguity in the face of violations of the Charter and international law. On the contrary, as a neutral country, Austria relies even more than others on the respect of our common norms and the strength of the UN Charter. As the international community, we should not, we must not accept that the most basic rules are undermined and weakened, while the ones violating the Charter shield themselves from scrutiny with the veto in the Security Council. Excellencies, colleagues, Austria does not provide weapons to Ukraine. But solidarity takes many forms. Since February 2022, nearly 100,000 Ukrainians have found refuge in Austria. Austria has provided 350 million euros of bilateral financial and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and its neighboring countries. Finally, Austria has consistently advocated for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, a peace based on the UN Charter and international law. But peace negotiations are simply not credible while bombs fall and missiles strike. We therefore need an urgent ceasefire, one that is actually respected, monitored and implemented. The United Nations and the OSCE, both with headquarters in Vienna, could play an important role in the implementation of a ceasefire or a broader peace agreement. Austria stands ready to support all genuine efforts towards peace, including by offering our good offices and hosting negotiations in Vienna, as has been done often in the past. And we will continue to do our part through humanitarian assistance, by raising our voice and by supporting dialogue. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Kamel for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, President, and thank you to the UK Presidency for convening this meeting, and to USG DiCarlo for her powerful briefing on behalf of the Secretary General. On this tragic anniversary, our thoughts go out to the countless Ukrainians who have been subjected to unspeakable suffering, and to the thousands killed during the past 4 years. The resilience of the Ukrainian people as they defend their country from brutal violence and stand up for the rules and principles of the UN Charter is an inspiration to us all. Exactly 1 year ago, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on the need for a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. And the Security Council adopted Resolution 2774, Path to Peace, which implored a swift end to the conflict and urged a lasting peace. Russia voted in favor of that resolution. But in the years since, it has openly and shamelessly violated it by not stopping its attacks and instead massively escalating them. Here are the facts, dear colleagues. In the midst of a freezing winter, Russia has cynically and systematically intensified its targeting of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, deliberately also targeting civilians. In 2025, Russia launched over, listen to this number, 54,000 long-range drones and over 1,900 missiles against Ukraine in 2025, after that resolution was adopted at the Security Council. According to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, civilian casualties in 2025 were 31% higher than in 2024 and 70% higher than in 2023. According to UNICEF, there was a 10% increase in child casualties in 2025. Almost all civilian casualties, 97% of them, verified by the United Nations, occurred in Ukrainian-controlled territories from attacks launched by the Russian army. So much for the Russian representative reminding us that Security Council resolutions are legally binding. That's rich. Dear colleagues, these are not the actions of a country interested in ending its war of aggression. Intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects is a war crime, and its perpetrators must be held fully accountable. The civilian population in Ukraine, including children, is paying the highest of prices. Let me recall that the General Assembly clearly confirmed last December the need to redouble efforts to facilitate the return of Ukrainian children who have been deported and forcibly transferred by Russia, and we look forward to an update on the UN Secretary General's efforts to that end. President, colleagues, the situation today is as plain as it is critical. Ukraine is ready for serious negotiations and compromises, as illustrated by their readiness to agree to an immediate ceasefire, de facto freezing the current positions of the battlefield. But Russia has not moved an inch from its maximalist claims. Our efforts continue to focus on achieving an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire and a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in line with international law and the UN Charter. This is precisely what was confirmed today at the GA Hall by an overwhelming majority of UN member states. The European Union will sustain its diplomatic efforts with Ukraine, together with the United States and other partners. We urge Russia to end its aggression and call on all members of this Council to join us in this message to Moscow. To have peace, Russia must be made to realize that its strategy of pretending to negotiate while extending its aggression will no longer be tolerated. Third countries that enable Russia's aggression must stop doing so too. We condemn the continued military support provided by Iran, Belarus, and their DPRK, and urge all countries, including all members of this Council, to immediately cease any direct or indirect assistance to Russia. President, to conclude, let me reiterate that borders cannot be changed by force, not in Ukraine, not anywhere. Any future agreement must respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. It must guarantee Ukraine's independence, long-term security, and ability to defend itself. No one wants and needs peace in Ukraine more than the Ukrainians. No one. And no one has a larger stake in European security than the Europeans. It is time for Russia to stop the killing and leave Ukraine's territory, which they illegally occupy. Today, more than ever, action by this Council is needed to end a devastating war that has lasted for too long. Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement, and under Rule 37, I now give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, we are entering the 5th year of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine, and the 13th year since the illegal annexation of Crimea. This war is not only a tragedy for Ukraine and its people, it's a direct assault on the foundations of international peace and security. The scale of documented Russian war crimes and crimes against humanity speaks for itself. Cities razed, civilians deliberately targeted, millions displaced, critical infrastructure systematically destroyed. Let us be clear, this is a war of choice, driven by calculated imperial ambition. Human lives are treated as collateral damage in Russia's pursuit of power by a permanent member of this Council, entrusted with upholding the very charter it now violates. The forced deportation, indoctrination, and militarization of Ukrainian children, combined with the systematic attacks on civilians and widespread atrocities, point to patterns of conduct that raise profound concern about genocidal intent. These crimes demand accountability. Excellencies, Russia's aggression does not stop at Ukraine's borders. Lithuania and other countries face escalating hybrid threats such as cyber attacks, disinformation, sabotage against critical infrastructure, airspace violations, and the instrumentalization of migration. These are not isolated incidents. They are coordinated elements of a broader strategy to destabilize our region, intimidate democracies, and fracture international resolve to support Ukraine. We are working together in NATO and the EU to identify and to respond to hybrid threats. In this regard, I would like to use this opportunity to call on this Council to take these activities into consideration and address Russia's escalating behavior. Russia does not act alone. Belarus, the DPRK, Iran, and other authoritarian actors actively enable this war through weapons transfers, military cooperation, technology support, and sanctions circumvention. This network of enablers is expanding the conflict's geopolitical reach and undermining global stability. The UN Charter is unequivocal. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, the prohibition of the use of force. These are not optional principles. Yet Russia continues to violate them while disregarding this Council's own decisions, including the Resolution 2774, demanding the cessation of hostilities. Colleagues, we have said it for 4 years and we say it again today. Russia must stop. Ukraine has demonstrated its readiness for a just and lasting peace. We support calls for an immediate ceasefire and meaningful negotiations including diplomatic efforts advanced by the United States and its leadership, notably President Donald Trump, aimed at achieving a comprehensive peace consistent with the UN Charter and General Assembly decisions. But peace cannot be imposed through aggression. Any future agreements must fully respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and guarantee its ability to defend itself. All members of this Council bear responsibility. Resolution 2774 must be implemented. The killings must end. And let us be equally clear. There can be no sustainable peace without justice. Accountability for international crimes committed in Ukraine is not optional, it's essential. We will continue to stand with Ukraine. We will continue to strengthen security guarantees. And we will continue to defend the principles of the Charter against those who seek to dismantle them. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
President, distinguished members of the Council, 4 years ago, Russia started its unjustified and unprovoked war of aggression against sovereign Ukraine. Russia's aggression against Ukraine continues to be the biggest threat to global peace and security. It constitutes one of the gravest breaches of international law and of the UN Charter since its adoption. Unfortunately, Russia's neocolonial imperial objectives vis-à-vis Ukraine has not changed. Kremlin wants the subjugation of the whole of Ukraine and the overturning of European security architecture in order to reverse the collapse of the Soviet Empire, Soviet Union. And here we will find the real root causes of this conflict. Colleagues, the first step towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine should be an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. We commend the efforts led by the United States to promote meaningful dialogue and advance peace. It goes without saying that any settlement must be firmly grounded in international law and in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Ukraine has consistently demonstrated that it is ready for peace. In contrast, Russia appears to be ready to continue its war of aggression until last Russian soldier and until Russia itself will collapse and disintegrate, sharing the fate of its predecessor, the evil empire. President, since 2022, at least 15,000 civilians have been killed and more than 40,000 injured in Ukraine by Russia, as verified by the UN. As we speak, in the coldest winter in the decade, Russia is desperately trying to use cold and darkness as a weapon to undermine the morale of the Ukrainian people. After 4 years of one major miscalculation after another and the loss of nearly 1 million soldiers, Russia still fails to comprehend resilience of the Ukrainian nation. As Ukraine enters its 5th year of a full-scale war, almost 11 million people require humanitarian assistance. On our side, and in addition to continuous supply of humanitarian assistance, to alleviate sufferings of the Ukrainian people, Estonia will host the Ukraine Recovery Conference in 2027 in Tallinn. President, throughout its war of aggression against Ukraine, Russia has been using the full spectrum of heavy weaponry, including the so-called Oreshnik missiles, capable of carrying nuclear weapons, against Ukraine's civilian population and critical civilian infrastructure. Russia also managed to damage the protective sarcophagus of a nuclear power plant in Chernobyl. The aggressor even put the functioning of Ukrainian nuclear power plants and thus the nuclear safety of a whole continent into grave danger. Such totally irresponsible Russian nuclear roulette should stop immediately. To end the war and bloodshed, all UN member states need to come together and to collectively put additional pressure on Russia in order to force it to peace in Ukraine. We also remain deeply alarmed by the continuous systematic deportation and forced transfer of Ukrainian children. Russia's behavior and actions in this domain are not compatible with the status and responsibilities of a P5 member and amounts to war crimes and crimes against humanity. In this context, we recall the ICC arrest warrants issued for Mr. Putin and Ms. Lvova Belova for the crime of deporting Ukrainian children to Russia and their illegal adoption. Accountability is a matter of justice and long-term security for all, and those responsible must be brought to justice. And I want to conclude my intervention today by underlining that Estonia's support to Ukraine and its people was, is, and will remain unwavering. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Thank you to the presidency of convening this important meeting on this day, and thank you to Undersecretary DiCarlo for the briefing. We mark the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and Mr. President, you said it at the beginning, it is indeed a grim milestone. It is also a day to mourn the countless victims killed over the course of this unjustified and illegal aggression. Every day of more bloodshed is a tragedy, and it is an avoidable tragedy. The war could easily end. Time and again, Ukraine has reiterated its readiness to agree to an unconditional, immediate ceasefire. And time and again, Russia chooses to continue its brutal warfare. While apparently engaging in negotiations, but stalling in reality, Russia sends rockets to destroy Kiev's heating system, leaving hundreds of thousands of people, young and old, sick and healthy, exposed to Arctic temperatures. This war, colleagues, has profound consequences for Ukraine, but also for all member states of the United Nations in so many ways, many of which have been mentioned today in previous interventions. And one very important consequence is the violation of the most fundamental norms of the United Nations Charter. Our common security depends on all of us jointly upholding these most essential norms. So this morning, the United Nations General Assembly sent a clear signal that the reckless continuation of warfare is not acceptable, and that the rules that we have all agreed to as member states of the United Nations matter. Russia must finally agree to an unconditional ceasefire and seriously engage in negotiations. This war has to end, and we will not rest to work until a comprehensive, sustainable, and just peace is achieved. The people of Ukraine have the right to live in peace and security within the secure borders of their sovereign nation. Germany reaffirms its continued and unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And what we do as Germany, I would like to underline at this point, for Ukraine and for European security, we do with partners, with allies, and with friends. And to our Russian colleague, who has unfortunately left the room, who selectively quoted from the speech of the German Chancellor in Munich, I would suggest that the speech was read and digested in full, because it clearly shows what we are doing and why we have to invest in our defenses, and the reason being the Russian aggression. And to not quote selectively, I would like to offer the following quote from the Chancellor's speech. Power politics in Europe is not an option for Germany. Leadership in a spirit of partnership, yes. Hegemonic fantasies, no. Never again will Germany go it alone. That is the abiding lesson from our history. End of quote. Colleagues, a lesson from our history and from World War II is that we have to abide by common rules that we gave each other and that we all supported in signing the United Nations Charter. And this is why we're here today, and this is what we're working with all of you, friends, allies, partners around the world. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic states, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. For 4 long and devastating years, the people of Ukraine have rightfully defended the country against Russia's full-scale invasion. Their resilience continues to command our utmost respect. Russia's aggression against Ukraine was unprovoked and unjustified. Its objective was and remains the subjugation of an independent member state. What the Kremlin envisioned as a 3-day so-called special military operation has instead become the largest military conflict on European soil in generations, with consequences felt far away beyond Europe. Mr. President, this war of aggression carried out by a permanent member of this Council constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and the UN Charter. It goes against the fundamentals of this organization and in particular this Council, which has been mandated to uphold international peace and security. The General Assembly has repeatedly, again this morning, called for a sustainable and just peace in Ukraine, grounded firmly in international law, including the UN Charter. Respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity is not an abstraction. It is a foundation for our global system of collective security. Mr. President, important progress is being made on accountability, including the work underway to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression and an international claims commission. We will ensure that aggressors are held responsible and that Russia will pay compensation for the damage caused by its war. Russia's aggression cannot be rewarded. It would create a dangerous precedent. It is in our common interest as UN member states to ensure respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of all states, both large and small. Let one truth be abundantly clear. No one wants peace more than the Ukrainians. They are the ones who have paid an unbearable price. It is their civilian infrastructure that has been destroyed. It is they who have suffered torture, rape, and summary executions. They have seen their children forcibly taken away in a systematic state-directed Russian campaign that has been documented by UN agencies. While Ukraine continues to call for an immediate ceasefire and a peace consistent with international law, Russia continues its systematic attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure aimed at spreading fear and weakening the resilience of Ukraine's civilians. Russia has created one of the world's largest humanitarian crises, and through its actions, it continues to show no genuine interest in peace. Mr. President, the Nordic states will remain unwavering in our support for Ukraine. We support a just and sustainable peace, a peace rooted in international law and the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sweden for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Señor Presidente, muchas gracias. España se alinea con la intervención de la Unión Europea y señala lo siguiente. Han pasado 4 años desde el inicio de la no provocada, injustificada e injustificable agresión rusa contra Ucrania. Y por ello, deseo comenzar reiterando la firme condena de España a esta acción frontalmente contraria a los principios más elementales del derecho internacional y de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Esta agresión no debe prolongarse un solo día más. Esta violación del derecho internacional resulta aún más grave por cuanto proviene de un miembro permanente de este Consejo de Seguridad, al que la Carta de las Naciones Unidas confiere la responsabilidad primordial en el mantenimiento de la paz y la seguridad internacionales y de salvaguardar los propósitos y principios de las naciones. Ningún argumento puede justificar una guerra de agresión que se traduce cada día en más víctimas civiles, en la destrucción sistemática de infraestructuras esenciales y en una crisis humanitaria de dimensiones globales. Rusia se dice dispuesta a la paz, pero en la práctica mantiene sus bombardeos indiscriminados contra la población y contra las infraestructuras energéticas, violando de manera flagrante el derecho internacional humanitario. A enero de 2026, Ucrania ha perdido más de la mitad de su capacidad de generar electricidad debido a los daños. La brecha entre la capacidad de generación y las necesidades de consumo ha causado interrupciones prolongadas en la electricidad, con civiles que solo tienen electricidad durante unas pocas horas al día o en algunos periodos no tienen durante varios días. La falta de electricidad ha privado a muchas personas del acceso a la calefacción y al agua en lo más crudo del invierno. Según los datos, se han producido más de 1.000 ataques contra infraestructuras sanitarias. Se han destruido o dañado 1.611 escuelas. El 95% de los prisioneros de guerra ucranianos liberados y encuestados han revelado haber sido objeto de tortura. Estos crímenes no pueden ni deben quedar impunes y requieren de una acción decisiva por parte de este Consejo de Seguridad. Rusia y sus dirigentes deben rendir cuentas por estas violaciones del derecho internacional humanitario y de los derechos humanos. España seguirá apoyando todos los esfuerzos diplomáticos encaminados a una paz justa y duradera al tiempo que mantendrá su contribución política, financiera, humanitaria y de seguridad en el apoyo al derecho de Ucrania a la legítima defensa. La comunidad internacional debe apoyar un proceso de paz entre Rusia y Ucrania, pero una paz que premie la agresión no sería paz, sería una derrota del derecho internacional. La paz que se alcance ha de estar basada en los principios que han garantizado durante décadas la paz y la
that have guaranteed international peace and security for decades. Without this, the international order, border stability, independence, sovereignty, and the integrity of states around the world will be threatened. If we allow one state to invade another to exercise coercion over its sovereignty without being held to account for that, no country will be safe. We must reaffirm the international rules-based order protecting large and small states equally. Spain will continue to stand at Ukraine's side unequivocally, convinced that aggression must always be punished and never rewarded. In the current context of negotiation of a peace process, we maintain that nothing that affects the future of Ukraine must be decided without hearing from Ukraine. The suffering and resilience of the Ukrainian people must be rewarded through a peace process in which they participate directly, in which their interests and their security are taken into account, and in which efforts and concessions are demanded equitably.
Nuestro mensaje es firme,
To
no admite
conclude, we have a
ambigüedades.
firm message,
Rusia debe cesar de inmediato
unambiguous
su
one.
agresión y
Russia
retirar
must
todas sus tropas
immediately
del
cease its
territorio
aggression and
de
withdraw
Ucrania
its troops
dentro de
from
sus
Ukrainian
fronteras
territory within its
internacionalmente
internationally recognized
reconocidas.
borders.
Solo así será
Only
posible
then will
abrir
it
el
be
camino
possible
hacia
to
una paz
open a way
global,
towards
justa,
a
duradera y
comprehensive,
basada
just,
en la
lasting
Carta
peace
de las
based on the
Naciones
Charter of the
Unidas.
United
Muchas gracias,
Nations.
señor
Thank you
presidente.
very much, President.
Well, gracias. I thank the representative of Spain for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, 4 years ago, Russia launched a full-scale invasion in Ukraine, seeking to redraw the map of Europe and erase a sovereign nation. Many thought that such actions belonged to the dark past of the previous centuries. But Russia reminded us that her imperial craving for colonies knows no such limits. 4 years later, Ukraine continues to valiantly defend itself against the brutal onslaught. Every inch of Russian sluggish progress on the battlefield comes at an enormous price in soldiers' lives and suffering. And yet, more than 1,400 days since the start of the three-day special operations, it continues to wage the illegal war in full disregard for human life, including that of its own citizens. The reason behind it is very simple. Moscow does not want peace. Moscow wants Ukrainian capitulation, while Ukraine wants peace, and that's the difference. Despite the diplomatic efforts of Kyiv, our partners in Washington, D.C., and the broader international community, Putin continues to seek a total subjugation of Ukraine, as we also heard today from the Russian ambassador. Excellencies, already today, this aggression does not stop at Ukraine's border. We feel it in Poland through hybrid attacks, sabotage, and cynical attempts to destabilize our society. So do many of our partners across Europe. Make no mistakes. These actions will not undermine our resolve to help a nation under attack. But they do carry a risk of escalation that should concern us all. And I want to put this to attention of this Council. Mr. President, through this aggression, Russia has betrayed the very principles of the UN Charter and international law. Violations made at all more shocking by the fact that they are committed by the permanent member of the Security Council, the very member that last year voted in favor of the resolution calling for a swift end to the conflict and urging a lasting peace. Excellencies, Russian attacks on Ukraine remain systematic and deliberate. Nearly every day, drones and missiles strike Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure. Attacks on energy infrastructure represent a calculated weaponization of winter. The strategy is simple: to break civilians through frost and darkness. This is terror elevated to the level of the state policy. We categorically condemn such attacks and refuse to remain indifferent. This policy is, however, failing. Ukraine is not defending itself, it is repairing, building, and preserving. This commands our deepest respect. Our thoughts are with the victims, but our actions must be with the survivors. Mr. President, what must we do? First, continue comprehensive support for Ukraine for as long as it takes. Half measures are not helpful. Second, maintain and strengthen sanctions, particularly on Russian energy exports that finance the war. Sanctions must bite. Third, persist in diplomatic efforts toward a just and lasting peace, defined and accepted by Ukraine as the victim, not the Russia as the aggressor. On our end, Poland will not waver in its support to Ukraine, be it government-led aid or heartfelt assistance from our citizens, NGOs, and the faith-based organizations. We have been helping Ukraine from the day one and mobilizing others to do so, and this will not change. It is my hope that a year from now, we will not be sitting here repeating the same pleas. It is time for Russia to end this war and finally understand that the era of the Russian Empire is over. Neither White Empire nor the Red Empire, for which the Russian ambassador was longing for today. Thank you.
Well, I thank the representative of Poland for their statement. And as there are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers, I want to thank all speakers for their contributions. Wish you all safe journeys. This meeting is adjourned.